So now to explain a bit more about what 5G is and to summarize its biological effect on living things and to endorse the inadequacy of regulation of its associated radiation, I'm going to introduce Professor Tom Butler. Tom's ranked in the top 2 scientists by discipline, 2% of scientists by discipline globally. His research focuses on operational risk associated with AI technologies, but is also intimately involved with investigating the risk that technology poses to society, including the risk of adverse health effects that wireless technologies present to humans. So, Tom, over to you.
Just to let you know what got me on this journey. Before joining academia and becoming a scientist, I was a satellite and terrestrial microwave communications engineer. And I always took for granted, really, having been aware of the safety regulations, that everything was covered. Until a discussion I had with someone who was the chief risk officer of an insurance company in 2015, when we were discussing the use of digital technology in a classroom. And he stated quite categorically, and something that really took me aback, was that the real danger, the real risk to children in the classroom was from the Wi-Fi systems, the radio frequency radiation systems, which is what 5G are based upon: man-made, polarized, pulsed radiation, which human beings, or indeed nature, did not evolve in. So that took me on a 4-year journey to critically assess the scientific literature on this, because I didn't believe it initially. But pretty soon I was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of studies that indicated a strong relationship between exposure to electromagnetic fields and radio frequency radiation of the microwave type, which 5G is, and adverse health effects in both animals and humans. So what is 5G and why will it make this potentially even more disastrous for the environment and humankind? Well, unlike 4G, 3G, and 2G, which use or employed macro and meso-level cells, and for which there were huge gaps in coverage, and which meant that there were whole areas that were weakly exposed to this type of non-ionizing radiation. With 5G now, it'll be ubiquitous. It'll be everywhere, because we're now going to micro size cells and pico-size cells and beamforming and technologies which, interest the engineer in me, will horrify the parent and grandparent in me, simply because there will be no escape from exposure to what are potentially ultimately life-threatening over the long-term exposures. And next slide, please, Mike. Oh, by the way, one other thing, right? And there was a piece at the previous slide at the end where, it's estimated that 5G will allow up to 1 million devices connect per square kilometer, whereas 4G is 100,000 devices per square kilometer, and that's in an urban area. And that would give you an indication of the levels of exposure we're going to, we are experiencing in 4G at the moment, and going to experience even more, because 4G is not going to be commissioned anytime soon. We will need it for the next 10 years, as indeed we've been using 3G and even 2G for many, many, many years since they were introduced. So this will add to the burden. So what's the issue? So both ionizing and non-ionizing radiation are in the electromagnetic spectrum, first of all. And the only reason why ionizing radiation gets so much attention, because it is quite dangerous, is that because the photons of energy can directly break DNA strands, and do other damage as well and cause cancer. Whereas non-ionizing radiation, the photonic energy is very, very low. However, the electromagnetic fields interact with cells of all biological entities, organisms, and trigger cell signaling. And the problem here is that that leads to the creation of, at a chemical level, reactive oxygen species. It leads to oxidative stress in cells, as well as other affecting the mitochondria. And this chemical imbalance in cells, in terms of its molecular makeup, means that it increases the risk of DNA strand breaks through chemical means, and ergo, cancers. But cancers aren't, the real issue here. Cells of the central nervous system are particularly affected here. And at levels, you can see the thermal effects, which are the heating effects, which are the only thing that's safeguarded against, occur at 10 watts per meter squared, whereas the non-thermal effects, those that you see on the, next slide please, Mike, those that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the non-thermal effects occur at up to 1 million to 100 million times less than the legally permitted limit. So that's very problematic. And what you see here on the right-hand side are the disease endpoints identified by 68% of the peer-reviewed research out there on the biological effects of radiofrequency radiation of the type that 5G is. However, if we move to the right-hand side and just briefly trace our way through it, you have non-ionizing radiation, radiofrequency radiation from Wi-Fi, from 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, which uses 3 bands: low frequency, high frequency, and extremely high frequency, and they each bring their own risks to biological entities. And so, as I indicated in the previous slide, and I was astounded to discover it, that this effect of cell signaling through triggering, for example, calcium ion influx into cells. So these very, very low signals, extremely low signal strengths and power densities, can trigger a chain reaction in cells that generate reactive oxygen species and free radicals, lead to antioxidant reduction and oxidative stress, and ultimately to disease endpoints. So the important thing here is that 90% of peer-reviewed research identify the association between radiofrequency radiation exposure and oxidative stress in plants, in experimental animals, and indeed in humans. And it astounds me that the body is charged with the health and safety of human beings and protection of the environment. Indeed, they disavow any protection of the environment. They say they're not interested in that, but they're just interested in preventing thermal effects in human beings. End of story. Next slide, please, Mike. And who's responsible? Well, the one entity that's responsible since 1992, well, its first set of guidelines came up in 1998, is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. Now, you might think, as I did, that this is an extremely large organization, like the World Health Organization, that it had somewhere in Geneva or this large offices with hundreds of scientists working for it, and because it's responsible for producing the guidelines on which all governments and regulators outside of the US, it has the FCC, create regulations that govern the introduction of all these technologies. Now, it will surprise you to find out it's only got 14 commissioners, and they're all part-timers. It's got one full-time employee, and it operates on a total annual budget of 138,000 euros a year. Its offices, it's got an office in Munich, which is hosted essentially by one of the German government environment agencies. And from the get-go, it's been self-appointed. Its first chair, Michael Rapaccioli, who was accused of corruption back in the early noughties, wormed his way into the World Health Organization, and in that move, he guaranteed the credibility and the status of this particular non-government organization. Now, these 14 commissioners, of course, are opposed by over 250 independent scientists or more, who've been advocating the precautionary principle in relation to the 5G introduction. But there've been a hell of a lot of activity prior to that in terms of advocating the precautionary principle in terms of protecting not only human beings but the environment against the adverse biological effects of these technologies. And indeed, people lose sight of the fact that the WHO itself, International Agency for Research in Cancer, that it identified radiofrequency radiation as a group 2B carcinogen back in 2011, and it's now being considered in the latest monograph for elevation to a class 2A or a class 1 carcinogen alongside cigarette smoke and all of the other environmental toxins we have in that category. Next slide, please. So, do the ICNIRP guidelines protect animals, insects, and the plant kingdoms? They don't. They state explicitly they're only interested in guarding against the thermal effects in human beings. And by the way, they classify fetuses and children the same as adults in that regard. It beggars belief what this particular non-government organization has gotten away with, because even though the majority of scientific papers point to an association, and indeed the US National Toxicology Program in 2016 to 2018, the final report clearly said it was clear evidence, the highest burden of scientific proof, that radiofrequency radiation was a carcinogen. And of course, they did that through studies in rats. But remember, most of these studies are conducted on plants and animals. There's no experimental studies on humans, just epidemiological studies. And yet, the majority of these studies point to environmental effects in humans, and as you'll see next, in insects and in plants. But because this is big business, it's a multi-trillion-dollar business. The biggest business in the world, one can say, right? Government and industries worldwide just don't want to know about it. And as a parent and grandparent, I'm kind of, as you can see from my presentation, I get animated about this, and particularly about, and I'll finish on this, the reticence of the media to look at the scientific evidence and make a decision for themselves. It's there. I saw it. I could do it. Any intelligent person could actually look at the literature and arrive at an informed decision about whether this stuff is good or bad. Thank you very much.